Today we'll have a lecture by Marc de Rosnay on the limits of social understanding. Sure to be excellent. Marc's a fantastic lecturer.
Most of you are pretty familiar with the sound of my voice by now, I imagine. First year emotion, second year social cognition, socio-emotional development, and third year everything. So I'm really happy to be invited to talk here, and I thought, oh, that's nice. I'll try out something new. There's a guy here called Sander Bergier. Some of you in third year, well, there's only one of you in third year, will remember Sander. He's a very handsome Dutchman who's working with us for a couple of years. In fact, he's just coming to an end now, but Sander and I are writing a book. And it might be called this. We don't know what it's called yet. It's something like this, right? Or maybe Theory of Mind is Dead or something. It's a bit controversial. Anyway, the book will contain a whole series of ideas. If you do fourth year psychology, we've designed a fourth year course for special fields on these topics. In fact, last semester we used that seminar to actually build up the content of the book with our students, so that was really good fun. Get those drinks circulating. I was hoping for beer and wine, but if Coke could come my way. So what I don't want to happen here is, when you study at an undergraduate level, you need to learn stuff, right? I mean, it's hard enough to learn stuff in psychology anyway, because everything's so slippery, right? But you need some sort of foundation from which you can think. And what I'm going to do today is take the foundation and say, well, how good is it? Okay? So don't take any of this on board for your examination. All right?
Even if it's relevant?
It is relevant, but it's not relevant. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because what I'm going to do here is, I think, just engage in a thought experiment, which is kind of a plausible scenario to me, right? And what it does is it causes us to question some really deep assumptions about social cognition and social understanding, what it's for, what it achieves. It's so important to us, especially, when you're young. It used to be even more important to me. It was more important to live it, in a new social world of the university when I was a first year than it is to study it as a 42-year-old academic. Really, our social existence is critical, and it's only getting more accentuated by new media and so on. So it's something that we cherish. It's something important to us as people. And there's been a very natural and deep assumption to take a step and say, well, because it's so natural and important, it must be something that's, evolutionarily selected for. It must be something that confers an advantage. It must be something that's real, right? So let's entertain some other possibilities and see how they hold up. So, you've all seen, all the second year people and third year people have seen this diagram. What is false belief understanding? First year guys, have you false belief understanding? You know what I'm talking about? Okay, so I need to just explain this first. This is probably one of the most highly used paradigms in psychology. It's called the false belief test. So, what happens between 3 and 5 years of age, it seems, is that children start to have a richer, fuller, deeper, thicker conceptualization of what it means to be a human being. Until about 3, they assume that you act on the basis of your desires. And from about 3, they start to incorporate beliefs into that conception. But they don't really entertain the possibility that you might hold a belief which is wrong. They just say, well, you might believe one thing and I might believe another thing. But from about 4 years of age, they realize that someone will act in the world on the basis of their motivations, desires, yes, but also on their conceptualization of the world from their point of view, on the basis of their beliefs. Okay? And these beliefs can be wrong. They can be false. And this is a classic test it's a very robust procedure. It's a classic test to show how this works. So this is Sally. This is Anne. Sally puts her ball or her apple or whatever in a basket, and she leaves. While she's gone, Anne moves the ball from the basket to the box. Now Sally comes back, and the question is, where will Sally look for the ball? And you all know the answer, right? She's going to look where she left it, because she has a false expectation that that's where it is. Okay? Now, this task comes out of comparative ethology. Okay? Because Premack and Woodruff asked the question, does a chimpanzee have a theory of mind? Is this the thing that differentiates us from the great apes, perhaps, other than more body fur, right? Is this the critical thing that puts us on a different plane to other animals, to other apes, you know? So, the child has something called, well, people talk about mental state understanding and folk psychology. The child comes to share in a folk psychological explanatory framework. We all rely on psychological constructs to communicate with each other. When I talk to you, I assume that you know all sorts of stuff about beliefs, desires, emotions, motivations, intentions, wishes, etc. I rely on that shared understanding for us to have a communication. And I bring that into our communication a lot. Okay? So the question is, this is what's called a folk psychological explanatory framework. It's folk because it's to do with ordinary people, right? As opposed to a scientific theory, right? It's a folk psychological theory, or folk scientific theory. It's psychological because it's to do with mental states, internal states, right? And it has this structure. It entails, it depends on, if you like, this core relationship between desires and beliefs, right? And Henry Wellman has been a really articulate psychological proponent of this view. And what he says is that belief-desire psychology allows us to conceive of two very different kinds of mental states, which turn out to be absolutely critical for understanding human beings. Beliefs can explain why two people with identical desires might do different things. So all the second-year students, you would have seen this yesterday, right? That's where it will end, this slide, all right? No, I'm just going to give the same lecture because I thought that lecture was so good. I'm just going all right? So one thinks there's an apple in the fridge and the other doesn't think there's an apple in the fridge. They both want an apple, but only one goes to the fridge because only one believes that there's an apple in the fridge, right? Desires, on the other hand, can account for why two people with the same belief might do different things, right? So one wants an apple and goes to the fridge. The other doesn't want an apple, so he doesn't go to the fridge. They might believe the same things, but they want different things. So that's just a nice way of illustrating what traction you get from having a belief-desire psychology. And it's called belief-desire psychology because beliefs are hierarchically more salient than desires. So when a child sort of achieves this insight, it's not like they dispense with the previous insights they had about psychology. They just incorporate them into this kind of richer framework. Right? So it's not like a defunct scientific theory that gets thrown out that they had previously. They've always emphasized the importance of desires. They've always understood the importance of desires and they've operated on those grounds. But now what they've realized, the argument goes, is that beliefs are more important. Okay? So, let's go back to Henry Wellman's core ideas. Right? Think about how profound he really thinks this is. All right? So I've called this the Speculations of Henry Wellman. Henry's a really good guy. And this is a great book. It's written 17 years ago, and he's redoing it right now, actually. He's sort of upgrading the book to the 13, how many years ago? 23 years ago. Right? You see, the brain's a bit tired after 2 lectures today, so you have to be patient with me. So he's redoing this book. But basically, I spoke to him a month ago, and he basically kind of still agrees with the core thesis. He thinks he's got a better way of explaining how all this comes about, right? He thinks neuroscience is helping him, or learning is helping him. But basically, he still thinks it's right. I checked that out with him just recently. So even though it's an old book, it still pretty much represents his core views. So, what he says at the end of the book, and he's got this kind of speculative section at the end where he says, what's the big picture? Right? Because most of the book's just a sort of grinding, empirical investigation of 3-year-olds, right? But at the end he kind of stands back and he says, well, most often I believe that some basic aspects of belief-desire psychology must be universal. That is, they're ubiquitous. All human beings, saving some sort of developmental delay, autism or something like that, all human beings think like this. These aspects include the fundamental distinction between mind and the world. So mind is a different sort of thing to the world. I mean, he'd be right there with Rene Descartes on this point. The basic difference, in fact, not just Rene Descartes, Darwin, Locke, Hume, Kant, right? They all have this view in some form. Okay? These aspects include the fundamental distinction between mind and the world. So that's the first thing. The basic difference within the mind between two generic categories of beliefs and desires. So these are two different kinds of mental phenomena, beliefs and desires. And the causal combination of beliefs and desires to produce actions. And what he says is, when I think that these may be universal acquisitions, it is not because I believe them simply to be innate, they just turn up innately, like photo perhaps, but more because I suspect that these are very real qualities of the mind itself. Okay? They are a true representation of something that we don't yet understand that is actually going on in the mind. Alright? Now, to his credit, Henry's not a fool, and he knows plenty of other points of view. He says, well, I can have a second mind. I can change the way I think. He says, certainly systems of faith or belief do exist that are so different from our contemporary Western point of view that they suggest that our core notion of belief that we hang on to so much, to which we accord such significance, that is seemingly central to belief desire psychology, may be irrelevant in certain alternative worldviews. And that's a kind of radical idea. But he ultimately says, but that's too radical. Some deep truths, he says, are captured in our theory of mind. And these truths must be seriously encompassed in some form by all common sense theories of mind. So that is to say, all cultures, at the very minimal standard for a folk psychological explanatory framework is that they make this core distinction between beliefs and desires, because it's true reflection of the mind. Is everyone on the same page here? Okay. I'll probably stand up so I can read these things better. There's a lot of text here because this is a new idea for me, right? So I'm thinking it through and I'm neck deep in books and cutting things out so I can keep track of ideas and stuff like that. It's like writing an essay, right? Now, Mike Tomasello at the Max Planck Institute has really gone full steam ahead with a actually quite an old-fashioned notion, that doesn't make it a bad notion, that what's really special about humans is apparent before they can pass false belief tasks. Okay? And what he says is that human cognition sticks out like an elephant's trunk, a giraffe's neck, a peacock's tail. That is to say, it's very distinctive. Right? It is one form of primate cognition, but it seems totally unique as people go around talking and writing and playing symphonies and doing math and building buildings and engaging in rituals and paying bills, etc. And he thinks all of this stems from human social cognition. Okay, so how does that all come about? And Mike's done some terrific work on this, and I use it in my lectures to illustrate to you the social cognitive capacities of infants. Although it's not clear that all those abilities are distinctively human, it's looking at the way that some of them are. So our hypothesis, he says, for this something additional, this something that makes the human being special, is shared intentionality, right? We propose that human beings, and only human beings, are biologically adapted for participating in collaborative activities involving shared goals and socially coordinated action plans. I'm going to need to stand up because I'm going to show you some videos. Not straight away, but eventually. All right. Interactions of this type require not only an understanding of the goals, intentions and perceptions of other persons, but also, in addition, a motivation to share these things in interaction with others. And perhaps a special form of dialogic cognitive representation for doing so, which I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a second. The motivations and skills for participating in this kind of we intentionality are woven into the earlier stages of human ontogeny and underlie young children's developing ability to participate in the collectivity that is human cognition. The collectivity that is human cognition. So what he actually says, he goes quite far, and what he says is shared intentionality, well, that explains theory of mind. You can't have theory of mind without shared intentionality. Shared intentionality, that explains language as well. Right? You don't get either of these things without shared intentionality. And insofar as these things are overlapping skills, it's because they rely on the same foundation. Okay, so it's a really big, strong proposal. And it is this, the shared intentionality, which makes possible uniquely human activities such as the creation and use of linguistic and mathematical symbols. These are big claims, right? The creation and use of artifacts and technologies that accumulate modifications over generations in cultural evolution. So Mike also has this idea, which I think, I'm quite inclined to, which is culture retains ideas, right? And the creation of social practices and institutions such as marriage and government that depend on collective beliefs. In short, what we will call skills of cultural cognition. And this is where I'll probably end with the really long quotes, so just bear with me a bit longer. So the proposal that comes out of their work at the Max Planck Institute is that some small difference came along which made a huge difference, right? And this is an adaptation for participating in collaborative activities involving shared intentionality. Now, I'm not going to take task with that. That seems very plausible, right? That we engage in shared goals, shared activities. We can have the same frame of mind, the same point of view, the same reference, and that causes us to do all sorts of things that perhaps other primates, other apes don't do. He says that this special thing, which requires selection during human evolution for powerful skills of intention reading as well as for a motivation to share psychological states with others. So what he's saying is he's putting this ability squarely in natural selection. He's saying that there was some selection pressure, and that resulted in powerful skills for intention reading. So it's not that we are the same as apes, actually. It's that we are better intention readers than apes. In ontogeny, these two components, so ontogeny, what it means is in the development, the growth of an individual child, these two components intermingle from the beginning to produce a unique developmental pathway for human cultural cognition involving unique forms of social engagement, symbolic communication and cognitive representation. Dialogic cognitive representations, as we've called them, enable older children to participate fully in the social, institutional, collective reality that is human cognition. Now, dialogic cognitive representations are the ability of the child to appreciate, keep in mind self-other equivalences, so it subsumes that capacity, and it's the ability of the child to keep in mind the representation of the like of you and me in a communication, right? There's two selves, as it were, involved in some activity. Now, these claims and Henry Wellman's claims tap into a much older problem in philosophy of mind, which is the problem called the problem of other minds, which has been notoriously difficult to crack. In fact, I just chopped this out of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a great resource if you ever need something. And this is what they say. The problem of other minds is the problem of how to justify the almost universal belief that others have minds very like our own. It is one of the hallowed, if nowadays unfashionable, problems in philosophy. Various solutions to the problem are on offer. It is noteworthy that so many are on offer. Even more noteworthy is that none of the solutions on offer can plausibly lay claim to enjoying majority support. So that is to say, within philosophy at least, and that's not, it's not necessarily a gold standard, but I'm just presenting you with a view. In philosophy at least, it's been a bit of a fruitless problem. They haven't quite been able to solve the question of other minds, how it is that we come to know about other minds. And I want to say a little bit about that. I don't want to go into it in too much depth, but those of you who study philosophy of mind, perhaps later on, will get into some of these problems. Now, Paul Churchland wrote an excellent book that I can recommend to any undergraduate student of psychology still, even though it's 1992. It's called Matter and Consciousness. Right? It's a really good primer, but it's a serious book as well. What is the problem of other minds? Well, Paul Churchland summarises that really nicely. He says, how does one determine whether something other than oneself is really a thinking, feeling, conscious being? Right? He says, well, the obvious solution to this is psycho-behavioural generalisations. This is the kind of old-fashioned accepted view, that you see people acting in reliable ways under certain conditions, and you make a generalization. But this sort of explanation has kind of been thrown out, right? Because it's kind of unbalanced. All you ever see is behaviour. You never have any evidence of a mind, of a thought, of a belief, of an intention. And the more attractive argument is the argument from analogy, which is we have privileged first-person access to thoughts, beliefs, intentions, wishes, motivations, whatever. We see other people acting in sort of equivalent kinds of ways, and so we just generalise our experience to their experience. All right? But, says Paul, how do we think about ourselves? Well, we do it with our folk psychological constructs. So you can't explain where something comes from with the thing that you're trying to explain. So there's a problem, right? So there's a bit of an impasse here. So how do we solve the problem of other minds? Now, Churchland has a solution of sorts. It's not an ultimate solution. He doesn't think it's necessarily true, but he thinks it's a plausible contender. All right. If we assume certain hypotheses and conjoin them with information about observable circumstances, so we could hypothesize that someone has a wish, and we could see how they act, we can often deduce statements concerning further observable phenomena, statements which it subsequently turns out are systematically true. You happen to like twisties, right? I postulate that you have a desire, I observe your behaviour. My folk psychological framework tells me, I postulate that you have a desire for twisties, and you know what? I put out an array of potato chips and other evil snacks, and you choose twisties. To the degree that any theory displays such explanatory and predictive virtues, that theory becomes a belief-worthy hypothesis, he argues. It has what is commonly called hypothetico-deductive justification. So any of you doing philosophy will know about that. Okay? In sum, says Paul, a theory about unobservables, a theory about beliefs, wishes, intentions, desires, emotions, can be belief-worthy if it allows us to explain and to predict some domain of observable phenomena better than any competing theory. This is in fact the standard model, the standard mode, I should say, of justification for theories in general. So does that look familiar to everyone? And this kind of adds credence to our folk psychological theory. It says, whoa, wait a second. You're not just a folk theorising person, you're actually a scientist. And that's a view that goes deeply into psychology. Scientist in the Crib, right? A book by Alison Gopnik, a recent publication. Piaget said the baby is conducting experiments in the world, producing things about the world. Churchland goes on. Consider now the network of general principles that constitutes folk psychology. This theory allows us to explain and to predict the behaviour of human beings better than any other hypothesis currently available. Note further that one's justification here need owe nothing at all to one's examination of one's own case. So he wants to get the self out of there a little bit, right? It is folk psychology's success with respect to the behaviour of people in general that matters, not with respect to the self. Conceivably, one's own case might even differ from that of others, but this not need affect one's theoretical access to their internal states. However different they might be, you can just have a different theory about that person and about yourself, right? No problem. So what's really going on here? Churchland is claiming that we have no better access to ourselves than anyone else, really. He's also rejecting the age-old philosophical assumption that we have privileged access to our own experience. What he's saying is we have to figure ourselves out. We have to become self-conscious, just like we have to figure everything else out. Okay? So the child doesn't come into the world self-conscious, he becomes self-conscious, just as he doesn't come into the world understanding anything really, he figures it out using this massive brain that he has. So let's just unpack some of these ideas. He's rejecting the age-old philosophical assumption that we have privileged access to our own experience. So the view, he says, that the mind knows itself first in a unique way, and far better than it can ever know the external world, has dominated Western thought for over 3 centuries. Think of Kant, right? Kant, says, if I don't know myself, then I don't know anything, right? Okay. But if one adopts a thoroughly naturalistic and evolutionary perspective on the mind, the traditional view quickly acquires a sort of fairy tale quality. After all, brains were selected for because brains conferred a reproductive advantage on the individuals that possessed them. Here we are with evolution again. How did brains achieve this, Paul? I'd like to ask you. How did brains achieve this? Well, he's going to tell us. Brains conferred that advantage because they allowed the individual to anticipate their environment, to distinguish food from non-food, predators from non-predators, safety from peril, mates from non-mates. In sum, a brain gave them knowledge and control over the external world. Brains have been beneficiaries of natural selection precisely because of that feature. Evidently, what they know first and best is not themselves, but the environment in which they have to survive. Can you see the compelling idea here? Brains didn't evolve to help us learn about ourselves, they helped us learn to survive in an environment. So it makes sense that brains are adapted to understand environments, not ourselves. You get it? Does that make sense to you? Do you find this argument compelling? I think it has a kind of intuitive feel.